G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to show you how you can improve the mobility of a stiff big toe. And what I want to go through in this video is I want to show you some techniques that I use clinically that seem to help free up a stiff big toe quickly. And as always, at the end of the video, I want to talk you through a couple of reasons for why your big toe may have become stiff in the first place. If we're not pairing it up with a broader conversation and a different perspective to try and help you understand why that specific joint in your body has become stiff in the first place, then it might be unrealistic for us to expect that this will go away and stay away forever. So with all that being said, the first thing we want to do here before we get to each exercise is we just want to get a general sense for how stiff that big toe joint feels in the first place. We want to make sure that you can get a general sense of how far that toe joint bends backwards. So if you can stabilize your foot with one hand, grab your big toe with your other hand, and just gently bend that big toe back as far as you feel comfortable, paying attention to obviously how far you feel it goes side to side, but also how it feels to go through that range of motion. Because if your left toe doesn't move as far as your right toe, that's important. But if it's also stiff and tight through that range, it can give us clues as to what structures might be restricting it. And again, spoilers, it's often joint capsular stiffness that restricts people's big toe extension, that bending backwards, more than anything else. But take stock of how it feels and how it moves to begin with before we go through each variation that we're about to go through, just so that you can see how much of an impact, if anything, these exercises might have on your big toe extension. So before we look at some of the more joint related exercises that we're going to get to, it might also be worthwhile grabbing a ball and go looking for some of the restrictions that you may have from a soft tissue perspective underneath that big toe. This is a really simple exercise. I've got a lacrosse ball here. You can use a tennis ball, you can use a rolling pin, use whatever you want to do. Now if you're sitting down on the ground, you may not be able to get enough tension through here. Sitting on a chair might be good. The other way that you can do this is you can stand up, keeping your heel on the ground. It allows you to sort of pancake through that tissue a little bit better. But once you've found a spot, pin it down and then just gently bend and flex that toe. And you should feel like that tissue sort of shears free underneath. And doing this sort of 20 seconds or 30 seconds, very quickly you'll feel like it'll subside a little bit, and you can go hunting for anything else through there that also requires your attention. But spending a minute or two hunting around for those areas should feel like it automatically allows that big toe to feel a little bit nicer. But in my experience, the majority of the restrictions that occur with a stiff big toe tend to reside in the joint or the joint capsule. So anything that we can do to bias that joint capsule a little bit more will only add to how beneficial these exercises are for you. So with exercise number one, we want to start at the most basic level that anyone can try. This is the most convenient way to improve your big toe mobility. Clinically, this is a technique that I would do to you if you came to see me. And there's no reason why you can't do it yourself once you start to get a feel for what we're trying to do. And essentially all we're looking for is we want to actively make that big toe bend beyond its current range. So like we did when we were testing, if you can stabilize your foot with your thumb essentially just along the line of the joint. So if you look at where your big toe joins, where the skin creases up is essentially where the joint bends or where the joint hinges. What we want to essentially do is we're going to grab your big toe and trying to stay relaxed here. We're going to try and gently use our other thumb and finger to pull that top part of the joint over the bottom part of the joint. We can go as far as you feel comfortable and we can just work in and out of that end range. We want to make sure that each time you bend this up that you're trying to find some resistance as you get to the end of that joint. You can work in and out of that range. You can get to the end of that joint and oscillate in and out of that end range just to prompt that joint to move a little bit more. Now to get a little bit more fancy, we can add a little bit of a tweak to this to potentially make it a little bit more effective. So when any joint closes down, not only does it hinge in that direction, but there's also a subtle slide in the other direction to maintain that joint congruency or stability. So what we can basically do, bend your big toe back, and then if we push gently down through that toe, we can start to do a mobilization that moves the top part of the joint down through the bottom part of the joint, again, biasing some of that joint capsule. So you can take up the slack, gently push down, just to find what part of the joint you feel is restricted, and then spending 30 seconds or a minute doing this, you should feel like it hopefully starts to give a little bit more than it did before. And then once you spend a few minutes doing that, we gently bend your toe again or stand up and walk around, you should instantly feel like there's a little bit more flexibility in that toe than there was before. So So once you've explored how you can passively improve the way that that big toe joint functions, we can take it to the next level if you want to try and respectfully force that to move a little bit better and a little bit faster. And we can do that by getting down onto the ground if it's comfortable for you. And if it isn't, you can certainly do this in standing as well. It's the exact same principle, but if you can make your way down here safely, it is a fantastic way to improve the mobility of that joint quickly, even potentially more so than the exercise we just went through. All you need to focus on is if you can get down onto your hands and knees, we want to make sure that you can curl your toes up underneath. You should feel like you can bias that big toe extension in this position. But just to make sure you're in the best position possible, you can sort of shift your body weight towards your little toe. You can bring it back around towards your big toe a little bit more. You can play around with your knee position as well to see which one gives you the most pressure through that. And if you can oscillate backwards and forwards just like we did before when you did it to yourself, depending on the angle that you're pushing through that big toe, you should feel a really nice mobilizing type feeling happening through the crease of that big toe. Again, if you want to progress this a little bit further, what you can start to do is you can start to lift your knees up off the ground. Doing so just puts more pressure through those big toes than what it would have if your knees were on the ground. Again, depending on how stiff and how tender this is for you, you might need to start with one knee up and just gently work back in and out of that extension, and then eventually work to the point where you can do both at the same time. And then again, once you've done that, reassess how those toes feel, get up and walk around, see how it feels to walk around, and you should be pleasantly surprised at how much more mobile that feels. So if the big toe extension mobility exercise is comfortable and you want to see if you can push it a little bit further, we can do that with a power band. Power bands are a fantastic way to bias joint capsular stiffnesses. And this is a little bit more brutal than the previous one, so please only do this if you feel like you've mastered the first one and you're ready for the next step. But again, all we're looking for is to have that band around the big toe. We want to make sure that the band is pulling back underneath the foot. So it's essentially the same exercise as before, with the big toes on the ground. We just want to have enough tension through the band so that it's trying to pull that joint apart back behind us. Same thing again, that tension on the band. I then want to find the knee position that feels like it's accessing that big toe the most. I'm just also shifting off to my right hand side. It also feels like it's really tensioning that up. And for here, in the previous one, I could easily lift my knees up to put more tension through the big toe. But because the band's adding a whole lot of extra tension, I'm more than happy staying here for the time being. It's a little bit tender for me, but hopefully after I've spent 10, 20, 30 seconds doing this, it'll feel a little bit less tender, a little bit more mobile, which is already starting to do for me. And I can then feel like I can lift my knee up a little bit more. I can possibly chance lifting both knees up at the same time. Now, obviously, it may take you more than 20 to 30 seconds to progress to that end stage, if you can get there at all currently. But with these exercises, we just want to give you different variations that you can try to find your level and to find the one that resonates with you the most and that give you the best, fastest, and most effective results possible. And of course, while it's one thing to hopefully successfully give you options to free up a stiff big toe joint, as I mentioned at the top of the video, it's also really important to pair this up with an understanding of why that exact joint has become stiff in the first place, so that you can address those issues as well, so you don't have to do these exercises forever or ever again. And once we explain some very simple mechanisms for why that big toe may become stiff, there's two other really simple exercises that you might be able to do that aren't specifically big toe related, that may have a positive influence over your big toe over time. So when trying to figure out why your big toe has become stiff, especially if it's just on the one side and the other one's relatively okay, often it requires us to take a bigger step back and not look at you as a big toe dysfunction, but look at you as a leg dysfunction and see what isn't functioning normally. And for most people that tend to develop stiffness in their big toe joints, there's one really simple thing that often stands out for the majority of people, and that's simply, instead of standing and walking with your feet straight, a lot of people tend to stand and walk with their feet turned out. And while that may not sound too important on the surface, it becomes more so once we show you what happens to that big toe. So one of the main reasons why it's really important to try and stand and walk with your feet straight is that it allows everything to be loaded in a linear plane. And by that I mean, when your foot contacts the ground and your body transfers your weight forwards, if your foot is straight, then the weight and the load tends to go through your first, second, and third toes more than most. This allows us to maintain a stable arch and just loads everything up in that linear plane, which is the way that it's designed to function best. But if you start to turn your foot out a little bit more, because we're still moving forwards, we're no longer translating that weight over the middle of that foot. We start to translate the load through the big toe and the arch of the foot. And what tends to happen over thousands and thousands of repetitions is we start to load up that big toe differently than we would as if we had our foot straight in the same plane. And because the body is an adaptive machine, if we're consistently loading up a joint dysfunctionally over time, it starts to stiffen, it starts to become tighter, and ultimately becomes dysfunctional. So as you can hopefully notice, if we're spending a whole bunch of time trying to mobilize a stiff big toe joint, but we aren't then talking about trying to straighten up that foot so that you load up that toe joint thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitious steps every day, then it can be really hard, if not impossible, to expect that big toe not to be stiff anymore. And something as simple as correcting those feet and consciously trying to be a little bit more linear with your motion will allow you to transfer the weight through your entire foot as a whole and not biasing that big toe in ways that you may never have thought of if you haven't taken the time to look down at your feet. And this brings us to the next conversation of why has your foot naturally started to turn out without you realizing it? And these next two exercises will hopefully help you address some of the causes of that dysfunction as well. So the first additional exercise you can try to get to the cause of why your big toes become stiff is the banded ankle stretch. Ankle stiffness can be one of the main reasons why we tend to turn our feet out as a way of your body trying to work around that restriction. So again, if you can grab the same band that we used for the banded toe extension stretch from before, but this time we want to place that band around your ankle, just below the bones at the base of the ankle, and we want to stretch that band out as far as you feel comfortable, stepping through with your other foot. The reason why we want to do this is we want to close that ankle down, much like we did with the banded toe extension exercise. We want to oscillate at the end of that range, asking the band to bias the joint capsular stiffness that you may have in your ankle. And what you'll notice is, as you bend that back knee, bend that back ankle, you might actually find that your knee will start to cave inwards to go around that restriction. And your body does this when we're walking. So instead of your feet being straight and your knees caving in, it's easier for your body to turn your foot out and travel forward still than it is to keep that foot straight and dump inwards. So that externally rotated foot position can just be your body's way of working around a restriction that you didn't even realize was there. So when we're doing this banded ankle stretch, we don't want you to be dumping into that internally rotated or valgus knee position at all. We want you to keep your foot straight, but create that rotation out as far as you feel you currently can, and then bend and flex through whatever plane that might be. You want to make sure that your big toe stays on the ground, plant that down, rotate your knee outwards, and oscillate in and out of the range that you currently have. Once you've done this for 2 or 3 minutes, you might find that when you're walking again, you should naturally feel that little bit easier to keep your foot straight without having the tendency to want to rotate and go around a problem. And then this brings us to our next issue, which is hip restrictions. Similarly, having restrictions at the front of your hips can compromise your body's ability to move in a linear plane and instead prompt it to rotate around that dysfunction. From a walking perspective, instead of having your feet straight and being able to let that back leg trail behind you, if you have some tightness at the front of that hip and you can't go back as far, it's easier for your body to turn your foot out to go around that tightness to allow you to extend your leg further before swinging around again. So again, if we can try and take away some of the tightness at the front of the hip, it will allow you to have your foot straighter, allow you to walk in a way that allows that leg to trail back behind you in a more linear plane, and ultimately allow you to load up those big toes differently than what you might naturally be doing without realizing it. And one of the best ways to do this is with the couch stretch. Now for me, I'll do this in this position where you get your knee back into the corner of the wall with your shin vertical, and then trying to get your other leg up into this high sort of lunge position. We then want you to keep your back straight and extend upwards as far as you feel comfortable. Now for a lot of people, you might find that you can only get to a certain point like this before you find all this horrible tightness at the front of your hip. If that's the case, you're welcome to push your hip down to the ground to try and find some of that restriction through the front of that hip. For a lot of people, doing this down on the ground is quite brutal, but you're most welcome to do this on a chair or a couch, as the name implies, where you're still trying to get your knee back into the corner of the chair and still trying to get yourself up nice and tall. It's just that you're raised up a few inches, which takes some of the demands out of your hip. But if you can come up as far as you feel comfortable, comfortable, looking for some tightness at the front of that hip, give it a really good squeeze your butt cheek at the same time, hold this for 5 to 10 seconds. When you relax, it'll give, then you might find you can give that a little bit further into the stretch before giving it another squeeze, holding that for 5 to 10 seconds, and consistently repeating that exercise until you feel like you've either become sick of it or you've stopped making progress. But ultimately, if you can take away some of the handbrakes through the front of that hip and through your ankle joints, you can start to create an environment that allows you to load up that big toe differently and hopefully more optimally than you would naturally be doing if we didn't talk about these things. So as always, I genuinely hope some of those exercises were helpful for you. And not only that, I hope that general perspective of why your big toe may have become stiff and tight in the first place was also beneficial. Let me know in the comments down below how you found all of that. Please consider leaving a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this type of content. But once again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.